It enables the gigabit access to homes and businesses to be distributed indoors, where it's actually going to be used by whether it's consumers in the home, whether it's hospitals, whether it's schools, whether it's industrial premises. It actually makes the fibre going down the street useful to those endpoints.
Hey, this is Martha DeGrasse, here again for the Wi-Fi Alliance. If this is your first time joining us on The Signal, thank you so much for being here. We try to deliver insight and perspective on Wi-Fi by talking with industry leaders. And if you're already familiar with our podcast, please take a minute to rate and review on your favorite podcast app. Okay, in this episode, we are going to be talking about the 6 gigahertz spectrum. There is a lot going on there. And we are super excited to welcome Dean Bubley, tech industry analyst and futurist with Disruptive Analysis. Hey, Dean, thank you so much for being here today.
Hi, Martha. Thanks for inviting me on.
Yeah, well, you have been an outspoken advocate for 6 gigahertz for Wi-Fi. The Wi-Fi industry's had access to this spectrum for 5 years. Now it may be in jeopardy. Give us a little bit of an update and give us an update on why you're supporting 6 gigahertz for Wi-Fi.
I followed Wi-Fi for 20 odd years and other wireless and radio technologies as well. And one of the main things that keeps cropping up is the importance of wireless for indoor use in consumer homes and business premises, whether that's commercial or industrial or transport or wherever. And so we've got a whole set of different policy and social and technology objectives at the moment, whether it's government and service providers pushing for fibre and gigabit to the home. Obviously, outdoor coverage important as well for mobile. But often we only think about what happens up to the front door. We talk about homes passed, whether it's by fibre or cable or anything else. And actually, really, we should be thinking consistently about good coverage, not just to every premise, but really to every room and every device. And that requires significant amount of a bandwidth if you want to have wireless connectivity for whole home use or through an industrial premise, especially if you want to offer good quality connectivity for demanding applications. And 6 gigahertz plays a major role in satisfying that because it's relatively clean spectrum, unlike the congested 2.4 gigahertz and the increasingly congested 5 gigahertz band. And so having access to clean spectrum allows new applications and greater density of devices and more flexibility in terms of sort of channel width and throughput as well. So 6 gigahertz has been super important. A number of markets, the US and others, have allocated a full 1200 megahertz between about 5.9 and 7.1 gigahertz for Wi-Fi. Some other parts of the world, it's been the lower part of the band, and there's still a lot of debate about what to do about the upper part. Maybe we'll come back to that. But a number of countries, in particular in North America, but also parts of Asia and South America and Middle East, have made that full amount available for Wi-Fi, or frankly, unlicensed technologies, but there's not much Bluetooth around is it? But that's been a big boon for provision of Wi-Fi in anywhere from, say, sports arenas to the home. So it's certainly something that I've been watching closely.
Okay, yeah. Well, in North America and I think in Europe, we see policymakers focusing a lot on cellular when they think about 6 gigahertz. What can members of the Wi-Fi Alliance do to help correct this imbalance?
Right. I would say that there's a very strong lobbying effort from the cellular industry, whether that's the vendors, whether it's GSMA, whether it's local telecoms associations around 6 gigahertz. And the style and flavor of that lobbying varies depending on whether there's an existing allocation or whether there's decisions to come about future. And I think that what the Wi-Fi industry already is, but could be even stronger at pushing back on, is firstly this point of beyond the front door. It's almost like going to governments and saying, you're such big fans of this idea of gigabit to the home or connectivity for businesses, for everything from industrial automation to AI. Think about what happens beyond the front door, because all of that economic benefit doesn't magically happen unless you connect up products and services and applications and devices appropriately. And most of what 6 gigahertz can do on the cellular side isn't going to go through the wall. It's not going to go through the door. It's not going to go through the windows often, especially if they're coated glass, which is increasingly common. And so I think the Wi-Fi industry, firstly, I don't think always shouts loudly enough. And I think there's some parts of the world where there isn't much of a local Wi-Fi industry presence. So in Europe, there's only a relatively small number of indigenous Wi-Fi companies and vendors. And I think that it would be maybe good if there was perhaps a European chapter of Wi-Fi Alliance that sort of spoke more in a sort of Brussels context. I know that the international folk or from the main US based organization go there, but it would be really interesting if there was a sort of European Wi-Fi Vendors Association or APAC or Middle East or somewhere like that. It might have a little bit more ability to cut through. The other side to this is, I think, perhaps going via academia. And I think that often policymakers, they listen to sort of telcos and vendors, but they also often have universities or they're funding research projects. And quite a few places have almost like a 6G university or a sort of national 6G or 5G center.
Like NYU has that, right?
Yeah, 5G or now 6G Innovation Center. I'm not aware of any country in the world that has a Wi-Fi innovation center. And frankly, that's something I think the Wi-Fi industry could almost try to encourage academia and the relevant faculty heads or look at the funding options. And once they're sort of inside the tech, then there's this sort of dynamo effect and spinning wheel effect between academia, policy, vendors, service providers, innovators, sometimes financial organizations as well. And it also, there's often in a lot of countries a bit of a club or an establishment where you've got the same people, they run the national event on wireless or advanced connectivity policy. And I think the Wi-Fi is often underrepresented that, and I think that maybe academia is a path to sort of increasing the noise floor.
Well, that is interesting. There is definitely a world-class university right here in Austin where the Wi-Fi Alliance is. That's very interesting. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the technology. Do you think that 6 gigahertz has the potential to meaningfully accelerate 5G or even 6G deployments?
Not really. And I've had this debate I famously got kicked off of a GSMA webinar at one point for asking all questions that, they basically first shut down the chat channel, and they just booted me off it when I kept asking awkward questions. And, the issue is around propagation. And there are some demos which show you can get 5G with what's called massive MIMO radio. So 64, 128 antenna elements, essentially blasting through the wall with 6 gigahertz. Now, that's the downlink. Uplink from your device out to a macro radio network, might be 500 meters or a kilometer or 2 kilometers away. You could pretty much forget about it. And if it's a building which has got steel reinforced concrete and what's called low E glass in the windows, it's not going to work. So essentially, the main use cases are for outdoor connectivity. And to be honest, apart from very isolated hotspots, I don't know, the middle of Times Square in New York or Oxford Circus in London or the equivalents in Seoul or Tokyo or somewhere, there are not that many places in the public domain that need the capacity density that you can't do with mid-band or low-band cellular. There's certainly venues, maybe sports venues as well, where you have every piece of frequency and bandwidth you can throw at it. But you don't need nationwide exclusive licensing to deal with a few stadiums. You could use something that looks like the AFC platform to give, and potentially the argument is that you have place-based licensing, and there's nothing stopping the cellular industry using unlicensed 6 gigahertz as well. For 4G and 5G, there have been not very successful, but there's been unlicensed versions of those. So as long as they're compliant with all the rules, in theory, they have access. And if there was this desperation for extra bandwidth, you would have thought they would have tried that. What we've seen so far, as far as I know, there's only been one auction of 6 gigahertz spectrum, and that was in Hong Kong. Now, to be fair, there's not much equipment around, but it was notable that the price that was paid for that was much lower both than many anticipated, but also considerably lower than sort of mid-band spectrum also auctioned in that market at the same time, or previously within a few months. So we'll see what happens. There might be a couple of others, but at the moment, the cellular industry also, although it talks up 6 gigahertz, it doesn't show an awful lot of enthusiasm for developing and deploying it even in markets where it's theoretically available. And there's a certain regulatory time lag here, and things that were decided in World Radio Congress end of 2023. But what we're seeing in a lot of markets is a slowdown in the traffic growth on public cellular networks, with the exception of fixed wireless access. I'll come back to that. But for mobile, and particularly smartphone use, it's flattened off, or it's a relatively small number of percentage points growth annually. In a lot of markets, including China and India, it's down to either single digit or close to it. And in some places, it's had quarters where it's been flat or even negative 1% because of the impact of better video codecs. And so there isn't at the moment the need for extra capacity on the cellular network. All of the things we were saying 4 or 5 years ago about everyone's going to be walking around with augmented reality headset down the street. Yes, there's a few people with Meta Ray-Bans, but most of that gets processed on your phone anyway, and very little goes up and down to the cloud. Most connected vehicles aren't streaming 24/7 4K video, even if they're self-driving, because most of the vehicle manufacturers don't feel the need, or they frankly don't trust always-on connectivity. You go to a conference and you say, right, who wants to be in a car with cloud braking? And you don't normally get much of a response on that. So at the moment, the demand side isn't there, the supply side isn't there, and so this sort of 5G and 6 gigahertz hasn't made much moves. As for 6G, well, again, by the time we get to 6G, firstly, we should have more data. Secondly, more data available on what's happening with usage. But they don't appear from and I'm doing a lot of work on 6G, and there's no obvious sort of killer use case. Now, and then you've got particular things where you do need more capacity for fixed wireless or for indoor. But for both of those, you've got lots more spectrum options. So people are coming back to using the idea of using these millimeter bands, which never really got traction. They're still sitting there for the cellular industry, and they're usable for fixed wireless, admittedly over shorter range. Theoretically, they're usable indoors if you've got devices that support it. It's notable the new iPhone Air doesn't support millimeter wave. It doesn't support 6 gigahertz either. And so that tells you something.
Yeah, that does. So let's talk about indoor just a little bit. You're saying that 6 gigahertz is very meaningful indoors for Wi-Fi, but for cellular, it's primarily used for outdoor?
Well, the vision for it is primarily for outdoor, for cellular. Yeah, people were saying, we can install it on the same cell site grid. For Wi-Fi, I mean, most Wi-Fi is used indoors. Yes, you get some coverage in parks and sort of outdoor sports areas, but it's relatively minor in comparison with either residential or office or venue-based Wi-Fi. It's sort of airports and cafes, places, but it's primarily, there could be industrial sites as well, which are mostly indoor. And certainly for those, 6 gigahertz is useful for Wi-Fi, both for connecting sort of normal consumer devices like smartphones and laptops, particularly in high density areas like, say, universities, where you've got a lecture hall with 300 people, all got phones and laptops, using them simultaneously. Or maybe sports arenas where people are starting to do streaming of the events and using uplink. Now, again, in some cases, they'll use cellular as well. And there's going to be frankly, both have a role to play, depending on the device, on the person, and so on. But the majority of indoor traffic uses Wi-Fi. Biggest use for downlink usually is TV, and then in a work context is what we're doing now, is Zoom and Teams calls, as well as most cloud applications. Things like robotics in industrial settings. There you could make an argument that once you move into sort of heavy industry and very, very demanding applications where you've got timing constraints and things, maybe private 5G is the answer, but that uses CBRS band in the US, or 3.8 to 4.2 in UK and 4.9 in Japan and Taiwan. Yeah, so although China has been talking about using 6 gigahertz for private cellular on campus, I think that's just a sort of, they put it out there because it sounded interesting. I don't think there's actually much happening yet.
Right. You bring up China. Now, during the Big Beautiful Bill debates, one of the recurring themes was that the U.S. is falling behind China in the 5G, 6G race. Do you think that's true? Do you think that spectrum can make a difference?
Firstly, there's no race. The whole thing's a myth. And I've been saying that since the earliest days of 5G. China has its own views on how it wants to promote cellular, and also it's got its own national champion in Huawei and to a degree ZTE or ZTE as well. So it's got its interests in promoting. And to be honest, when you look at the spectrum allocations, I've been very, very critical of some of the comparisons, which seem to be, let's just say, slightly arbitrary. So CTAA I've criticised specifically for having a definition of mid-band spectrum which seemed to be, let's just say, novel and somewhat self-serving, because it managed to somehow exclude a big chunk of spectrum that T-Mobile holds in the 2.5 gigahertz band, which most of the world, most of the vendors, and even the GSMA and Ericsson and Nokia and everyone else would have called mid-band, but which CTIA decided in its wisdom not to count. And so when you actually look at the numbers that were published, we have a spectrum deficit in mid-band, well, if you define the numbers arbitrarily in a particular A and B point, you can always find something to prove the point you want to make. But for most people's definitions, there was no deficit. And they also, very amusingly, they included in China's count a particular band that China has dedicated for shared indoor low power use between 3.3 and 3.4. And they added that into their calculation without realizing that it was almost like proving the necessity of indoor wireless.
Okay, well, in addition to defining mid-band spectrum, CTIA, as you very well know, also tracks mobile traffic. And they said that cellular data has reached 132 trillion megabytes in 2024, up 32 trillion from 2023. I think that's a pretty big increase. I think you're measuring it differently. So help us understand how you see cellular data traffic not really growing as quickly as that.
Right. Cellular data traffic in the US is heavily skewed by inclusion of fixed wireless access traffic. And so the US is one of the countries around the world that has had the fastest growth of 5G being used for FWA, primarily in sort of rural, but also in some suburban areas, primarily as an alternative to older cable plant or sometimes DSL, understandably. And I can't remember the exact number, but it's something like 12 million or so additional users during that period that started using it. And they have an average of something like 500 gig a month or some number that's of that order. It might be 700, it might be 400, but it's hundreds of gigabytes a month. One fixed wireless access user is equivalent to maybe 20 mobile broadband users. So those numbers, they're interesting, and they're certainly larger growth than in a lot of markets, but you have to understand where they come from. And that a lot of it is around FWA, which tends to be sort of both localized, and interestingly, it tends to be used in the relatively quieter cells. So it tends to be used in those areas where there's actually spare capacity and there's no capacity crunch, and often they haven't lit up everything they've got. So really the sort of the total throughput numbers you have to think about are what are the peak throughputs and what is happening in the congested cells. And the congested cells are typically the urban downtown cores or major retail centers or sports venues and so on. Often they're the ones that don't have FWA because the residential population is near zero. So you start looking at this and thinking, well,
and also because their cell
I could add together and come up with some big numbers, but is that spectrum the right answer? Now, the other thing about the OBBA was this agreement on 800 megahertz of additional spectrum over the next however many years, some of it coming from government spectrum, primarily military, and some being repurposed. Essentially, it was more driven by the Congressional Budget Office, I understand, that wanted to raise $87 billion through auctions. I'm not entirely sure that investors in operators are particularly keen on that, but we'll cross that bridge separately. And so then the question is, where does that 800 come from, or whatever the proportion that is due to come from? But I think it's between 1 and 10 gigahertz. Now, then you get into some accounting of what bits of it are possibly available, and maybe it's the 4.4 to 4.9 range. I know that there's a lot of concern in both the Wi-Fi community about 6 gigahertz, and also the CBRS community around the 3.55 to 3.7. Is some of that going to get clawed back, then auctioned off? I think that both of those are difficult for different reasons. And I suspect that the FCC will look at it and probably go, you know what, both of those are difficult to do. Technically, economically, they'll probably have multiple years of lawsuits, and it might not even work in the end. And then also, there's a sort of almost like a moral hazard that if you establish the principle that actually the FCC can come back a few years after awarding spectrum and then take it away again, what you do essentially is you've then forced everyone with spectrum on their balance sheet to go back and revalue their assets with a new risk. And so potentially you've then just cost the industry a huge amount of money by adding a risk factor which wasn't there before. If I was an investor, I would not be very happy about that. So I think they're going to look for alternative solutions. We saw EchoStar offloading spectrum to AT&T, which partly solves its mid-band problem, and then also to SpaceX a couple of weeks ago. I wonder if they're going to try and finagle some way of counting that towards the 800 of, we didn't actually auction it, but you know what, we're going to try and impose a tax on, SpaceX or AT&T or on EchoStar's returns from that, and we'll sort of maybe knock that off. To be honest, I think that's not actually a bad idea if they do that. But I don't know what the legislative aspects of that would be.
But we do know that the government will raise a lot of money if it goes ahead and auctions that spectrum. Stepping back, though, do you think that spectrum auctions are actually the most efficient way to get spectrum to the best users, or do you think that the government, from a technology and end-user benefit perspective, should explore other frameworks, like dynamic spectrum sharing?
I think dynamic spectrum sharing and also a new auction model. So one of the things that I'm seeing in some parts of the world is saying, well, actually, we might have auctions, but either they're localized rather than nationwide. Maybe they're conditional. Maybe they're like a reverse auction in terms of outcomes. Whoever says they'll cover the most people or provide the most capacity will get it, rather than a cash auction.
Yeah, we've had some spotty history with that in the U.S.
Yeah, there's certainly a general move towards that, although I have to say that the current FCC seems more minded to sort of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it type views of the world at auctions. But, who knows? Maybe these things change over time. For example, in the UK, we're about to have a millimetre wave auction, but it's for urban areas are going to be different to rural areas. And it's going to be city level auctions. And there's going to be sharing components and pooling components. And so there's certainly a fair amount of innovation in that spectrum assignment world. And to be honest, one of the things that baffles me is the US, through a combination of Wi-Fi with AFC and CBRS with SAS, is one of, if not the leading country in terms of dynamic spectrum allocation and automation platforms. And it's, to me, somewhat odd that the US authorities don't recognize that and want to actually extend and almost evangelize that principle of saying this is an area where the US has undisputed technology leadership over China, is around this dynamic spectrum allocation technology. And it seems to be willing to throw it away for more straightforward auctions, which strikes me as a bit strange.
All right. Well, this has been great. Let's wrap it up. If you were in front of a set of U.S. or even, say, global policymakers right now, in 100 words or less, what is the reason that you would say 6 gigahertz needs to be protected for Wi-Fi?
I think it's critical for Wi-Fi because it enables the gigabit access to homes and businesses to be distributed indoors, where it's actually going to be used by whether it's consumers in the home, whether it's hospitals, whether it's schools, whether it's industrial premises. It actually makes the fiber going down the street useful to those endpoints. That's the main one. It also reduces interference risks and allows for greater innovation around both the Wi-Fi industry, which again is a US strength, but also the IoT and device sectors as well.
All right, excellent. Dean Bubley, tech industry analyst and futurist with Disruptive Analysis. It's been great to have you on the podcast and great to see you today.
Thanks, Martha.
Thanks for being here. And that is our show. You can follow The Signal on your favorite podcast app or at the Wi-Fi Alliance. That's y-fi.org. I'm Martha DeGrasse, here for the Wi-Fi Alliance. Thank you so much for listening, and please join us next time for The Signal.